This is Jim from Portage M&A Advisory, and you're listening to the Selling Successfully podcast, the show that simplifies selling your business for those thinking about moving into the next chapter of life. If you like what you hear, please follow or subscribe to find us easily and listen again. We're here when you need us. Today we're talking about all things buyers, who they are, what drives them, and how a proper profiling process can help sellers find their perfect match. Joining me today from Portage M&A Advisory is our very own Thomas.bevilacqua, who's our VP. Thomas, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. I think it's a topic that oftentimes everyone asks us about, so I'm looking forward to diving into it today.
Cool. No, I appreciate it. And you know, so everyone is aware, you've got about a decade of experience now working with smaller companies, bigger companies. You're well-versed kind of across the board, and I think folks are going to find this extremely important, extremely relevant at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. I think we spend a lot of time working with privately held small businesses, and a big part of the equation for us internally is really dealing with the buyers in the marketplace and understanding what they're looking for, so that eventually we can pair them up with our clients that we're representing.
Right. And as you know, the big question that we always get, where do buyers come from? And I know we have this discussion, numerous times throughout the engagement. It's a concern that oftentimes sellers have. It's something we're not as concerned about because we're familiar with the process, but I think it is an important discussion point. And, at the end of the day, there's more to buyers than meets the eye, but, excited to just share a little bit about where the buyers come from, how we look at them, how we evaluate, different types of buyers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the interesting things that we've seen before is oftentimes a question we get is, are there even buyers that exist by a lot of these privately held business owners? So the answer to that is there's several, and they come in all different forms and shapes and sizes. The buyer pool and the buyer universe is actually quite diverse. And yeah, ultimately I think it's a piece that many business owners should be well aware of, understand what types of buyers exist out there, and best prepare for when a buyer eventually does approach them and how to navigate that process with them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess for context, what we can say too is we're talking lower middle market. So, I think most people have seen some of the common Netflix shows about, M&A and the sexiness of it and how there's big corporate M&A teams. But, finding buyers for your, let's call it privately owned business, is not that uncommon, and folks are looking. So when we talk about lower mid market, a lot of the deals that you handle, we're talking about businesses that could be anywhere from, on the small end, $3 million, but could go up, to 30 to 50 million. So it's a wide range of business sizes. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think one other interesting aspect within that space is the buyers are extremely experienced, right? Mm. So they do have a playbook. Oftentimes they've bought a number of businesses before, and perhaps they own a portfolio of companies, right, which they've acquired. You pair that up with a marketplace where certain business owners have never sold or bought a business, and there's a bit of a mismatch, right? Because you have, an individual that's been there and they've done, acquisitions before, and they really know how to navigate that process because of their experience. The other piece would be the sophistication they bring from an advisory standpoint. Having navigated the deal before, they know the importance of bringing in the right deal team, being the right accountant, the right lawyer, and the right commercial banker to help fund the transaction. So, we want to make sure that our clients have that same representation as well, knowing that the buyers are going to be very, excited and eager to move forward on the deal at quite a quick pace, right? So we want to make sure that our clients have the same representation and are able to continue moving forward on the deal.
Right. So finding the right buyer is key, is kind of what I'm hearing. Let's step back. Let's talk about where we find the buyers as step number one. You've now got a business you represent. We've got the marketing materials ready to go out. How do you and the team find a buyer?
Yeah, great question. So I would say we break it down into a few different phases. And the first phase that we always try to go through within our buyer outreach would be tapping into Portage's internal proprietary database. So throughout the years, we've built a database with hundreds of acquirers, hundreds of buyers that are all in different shapes and forms. So we would typically lean on our own network of buyers that we've built as phase one. The next phase, and this is where it really will depend on the type of transaction that we're looking at, we will also be building lists and doing research on what players exist in that space, just depending on what niche or what industry the business may exist in. The last one would be within our broader network, and this is where we also spend a lot of our time is just connecting with other professionals, whether it be accountants, lawyers, bankers, or other M&A firms. Each of them have quite an extensive client list where we're able to tap into those professional networks and see if an accountant has a client that's looking to make an acquisition, or even more specific of an example, an M&A firm that represents clients on the buy side and is looking to get involved in a sale process because we have a mandate that overlaps. So that's a very specific example of where our network can really be helpful in searching for the buyers. The other one would be the Cornerstone Alliance as well. So we are a part, and I'm sure you've talked about it on the show before, of the Cornerstone International Alliance, which is a network of essentially 30 very similar M&A firms to Portage. So through that network, we get access to a number of potential buyers that really spans predominantly in North America. So for us in Canada, access to a lot of American buyers, as well as overseas in Europe as well.
It's quite powerful for sure. And I would say too, if you segment buyers by industry too, that's where it becomes super powerful, right? Where we may be selling a niche tool and die opportunity in southwestern Ontario, but our reach is not just local. We've got a dedicated team. You and your team will talk to the Cornerstone folks and say, hey, has anyone sold a business this size, with these nuances? Can you let me know what the experience was like? And then also, were there key buyers that were at the table? And so you can leverage the network that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very powerful that way.
And Thomas, the other piece that I wanted to touch on too is, every day folks are finding us. We obviously have a website and we put out educational materials, but every day people call in, quality buyers are searching for opportunities. They will call in, they'll find us. And part of the process is ensuring that we're, asking the right questions, we're ensuring that they're capable buyers, inputting them in the database and making sure that if an opportunity comes across that's relevant and a good fit, we reach out to them. Could you chat a little bit more, about this and what we see and, the sort of people who do call in?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one piece that's pretty interesting, we were just looking at our system the other week and we ran some numbers. Ultimately, it boiled down to about one buyer reaches out to us per day. So we're connecting with one new buyer virtually every single business day. And they ultimately will reach out typically through the website and want to get involved in our deal flow. So they're looking at making an acquisition. They know that we have sell-side opportunities, and as a result, the buyers are doing their own research and trying to connect with firms like us in order to get tapped into some of that deal flow.
So Thomas, we talk about buyers and outreach. And good buyers will come and find us. What is driving the buyer outreach? Why are they coming to us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the main reasons would be just the availability of capital, both dry powder on the sidelines and access to bank financing. Mm-hmm. We've seen the banks continue to be quite aggressive in the lower middle market and wanting to fund transactions. That paired with just how attractive the returns are in this space, that is really driving the number of buyers that we see inbound reaching out to us, trying to look for opportunities and businesses to purchase. It's a really nice storm for them.
Right. And before we jump into the right buyer, I guess the other avenue that's been quite fruitful is us showcasing some of the opportunities in the newsletter and being anonymous about it. So we're not obviously giving away the business name, but providing a high-level teaser. As you mentioned, networking is important. Having a good, vibrant network. Statistics will usually show that the buyer comes within a couple hours of the location. Not always the case in larger opportunities.
Yeah.
But talk to me a little bit about our network, bankers, accountants, private banking. When they see the newsletter or they see the distribution list with the opportunities, how do they use it and how does that benefit us?
Yeah, again, I think it's just the power of the network and knowing how much capital is out there looking to be deployed and looking to find the right home. Oftentimes, that home that people are looking for is a privately held company. And our contacts, our network, whether it's an accountant or a banker, know that very well. And as a result, when they see opportunities that we have, they'll likely share it with their network and see if it's something that they want to further explore, right? So just as another simple example, perhaps a commercial banker has a client that owns a manufacturing company, and we have a sell-side mandate or a business that we're working with that is also a manufacturing business. Through our outreach and through our newsletter, they would see that, again, on an anonymous basis, and they would forward it along to their client to see if that's an opportunity that they would like to work on together.
No, that's a great point. And we've heard this time and time again. The business owner or the buyer, oftentimes have, tightly knit relationships with their accountant or lawyer or banker. And, we obviously want to tap into that space and make sure that, if there's someone looking to acquire, we send them the information they need so that they can search through their database and see if there's a match. So just pivoting here, Thomas, let's talk about the right buyer. There's certainly lots of people out there. The last thing that I would want if I'm selling my business is, someone to come to the table. I invest a lot of time and energy. I share all the sensitive information and then find out they're not qualified. What do we do to qualify, or how would we position a buyer as the right buyer?
Yeah, another really, really good question. I think if I'm selling a business, that's probably one of the first things that I want to know as well, right? How do we vet the buyers? How do we make sure that, it's going to be fruitful use of our time to continue speaking with them and meeting with them? And why would we want to disclose, sensitive information with them if they're not already vetted, right? So I think ultimately the piece that we spend a lot of time focusing on is really the fit aspect of the transaction and understanding why that profile could potentially fit in with what our client is looking to achieve. So understanding what the best or ideal outcome is that our client is looking for oftentimes is a good starting point to then try and look at what buyer profile matches what our clients are trying to do, right? In some instances, our clients naturally want to sell to someone that's in their industry for a number of reasons. One of the main ones being there could be an easier transition period if you're selling to someone that is already well-versed in that subject matter. They're an industry expert. So in that instance, then I would, look out to the market and from a fit standpoint, I would say we are likely looking for someone that's either up or down your supply chain or perhaps even a competitor as the ideal fit, right? In other instances, there may be a situation where because of competitive reasons and confidentiality, you may want to stay as far away from your competitors as possible, right? And we've seen that as well. And in those instances, the best fit might actually be reaching out to a bit of a broader network where perhaps it's a financial sponsor, a private equity group, a family office where they have a diversified portfolio of businesses, but maybe not a direct competing business. And as a result, that fit may actually be better. But just tying it back to the earlier conversation or the earlier question that you asked, I think a lot of the times what we see, having a local presence is another piece, especially within the lower middle market. Again, deals kind of 3 to 30 million, where having someone that's local is another aspect that can be really beneficial just for building the relationship and truly figuring out what the fit is between the buyer and the seller.
So if I understand you correctly, and I want to summarize this, correct me if I'm wrong, but the buyer fit really boils down to the objective, the seller at the end of the day. What are they looking for? Is it a legacy play? Is it keeping it very confidential and they're fearful that people will become aware that they're selling, or is it maximizing the proceeds? So at the end of the day, it really does boil down to the preference of the seller.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We, in a previous episode, met with PCS owner Len Hume. You'll remember Len quite well, and legacy was really important to him, as was ensuring that there was enough proceeds on close, right, so he could have a successful retirement. And so there were a few pieces intermingled, but at the end of the day, and you'll recall this deal that you worked on with your team. It was really sitting down, trying to prioritize, okay, what exactly is he looking for? And then how do we navigate the outreach so that they're comfortable?
Yeah, exactly. And again, tying it back into the other part of that question, how do we vet that buyer once we establish that they are the right fit? I think we really lean quite heavily on their track record, to be quite honest. You want to understand what someone has done and understand what their experiences are and how that lends to this acquisition or the prospective deal that they're looking at acquiring, right? Their track record can speak volumes for what it could be to work with them in the future. And that's where we spend a lot of time just understanding buyers' stories, both their kind of professional careers, what their entrepreneurial ventures have been, how other contacts in the space have managed to work with them and what their experiences are. So we do spend a little bit of time just kind of cross-referencing what others' experience have been navigating a transaction with a buyer, for example, before wanting to endorse them to one of our clients.
Right. So Thomas, let's talk a little bit about the capability interview. And let's say you interview a buyer, you have a phone call with them in a meeting, but they don't check all the boxes. Is there any way in which you can work with them? Is there, any opportunity for them down the road, or can you give me an idea of what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think with any conversation that we're having with buyers, we really want to understand what their intentions are as well, right? So ultimately, we understand what the ideal outcome is for our client, and we have to try and flush that out through an interview with the buyers to ensure that they would be respectful of kind of the legacy or the ideal outcome that our client's looking to achieve. So asking them questions just around, what their plans are for the business, right? Are they looking to lay off employees? Oftentimes that's not the case, but it's always something that you have to ask to ensure that you are aligned, right? Are they looking to completely rebrand the business, or do they want to keep the goodwill and the brand name that our clients have built in existence after the acquisition, right? So really understanding what their game plan is, and especially what their plan is in regards to adding value to the opportunity. Those are all aspects that we want to understand as part of vetting the buyer to ultimately feel comfortable endorsing them to our client. So really what we're trying to do is better understand what their intentions are. It might seem like a bit of an interrogation from time to time, but really we just want to ensure that their interests are aligned so that we're making good use of everyone's time by continuing to progress them through a transaction and eventually introducing them to one of our clients.
Right. And from my experience too, and I'd love to get your take on this, a good buyer is usually going to be transparent, open, to collaboration. Oftentimes too, they're curious as to what the intentions of the seller are. They're very inquisitive. At the end of the day, they have done a lot of research. They're very keen. They're really trying to understand the business inside and out. And obviously, it's a little bit like an interview where they call in, they're talking to you. Whereas I would say some of the buyers who may not be as good of a fit are the ones who are extremely pushy. They ask for information prior to signing a non-disclosure agreement. They have not talked to a banker. They have no idea how to navigate the process. They may work in the industry, but they're not very, I would say, sensitive or understanding around confidentiality. Do you find this is the case too in some situations?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the buyers we speak with, I think, naturally are very analytical and have a very strong background just in understanding kind of how businesses run, and especially understanding the financial side of a transaction. And what we try to place a lot of emphasis on is how do they really just work with people, right? What is their focus on just the human element of the deal, we can call it, and will they be respectful to a lot of our clients' wishes or our wishes with respect to how we're conducting the process. I think that's very telling of just how we can help vet buyers for our clients, is how well, you know, a buyer progresses through the process, knowing that there are certain steps that need to be followed to kind of respect our clients' wishes, right? So that is a, you know, very important aspect of our decision-making tree, if we had to have one, while working with buyers.
So let me put you on the spot here, Thomas. And we saw this a lot during COVID, where sellers, business owners would get unsolicited offers from buyers. They'd receive an LOI or an offer. You know, some search fund would send a letter saying, hey, want to buy your business, here's what I'm willing to pay for it. They haven't done significant amount of due diligence. Oftentimes they did receive some information, maybe some of it was public. What would you tell a seller in this instance? Like, in terms of vetting this buyer, is there really something there? Should they be getting excited? Are they almost done? Are they close to the finish line? Like, what's your response to the situation?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of that as well, where there's constantly outreach that's being sent on a proprietary basis from buyers reaching out to businesses, trying to gain interest in potentially making that acquisition and buying a company. I would say the piece that we would focus on is really how long has that relationship been going on for, right? If it's just a cold call or an email that ends up hitting, you know, their junk inbox, for example, and then they see it a few months later, how pure are their intentions, right? Are they reaching out to 1,000 businesses, or do they truly just want to acquire your business because they're fascinated by it? If there is a relationship that's been developed there, and you know the buyer's invested time, energy, and resources into truly getting to know that business, I would say you probably have, you know, a better buyer at the table. If it's just someone that is sending outreaches to everyone, it's tough to determine what their true intentions are, right? And that's where I think bringing in an M&A advisor who speaks with a number of buyers and can help kind of vet them against all the other individuals that we speak with can be really helpful. Because if you're a business owner and you only have, you know, maybe one or two buyers that have reached out, it's challenging to really set a benchmark for what the best buyer could be if you just haven't had the opportunity to have many touch points with potential buyers out there. The other piece is when there are fewer buyers at the table, there's a little bit less control for the business owner, because the buyer typically does know that they may be the only party that's at the table for negotiations, for example. So it's an interesting predicament to fall in as a business owner. I think it's a very positive thing if you have people reaching out, but likely worth getting a second opinion and just having someone else take a look at, you know, one, who the buyer is, but also beyond that, what the structure of the process looks like. Because what we've also seen is, regardless of how great the company actually is, if we aren't able to package that information in a manner that a buyer can digest it, it'll be very challenging for both parties to get to the finish line and execute the transaction. So although it's an exciting, I think, you know, part of the process, an exciting time to receive an unsolicited offer from a buyer, there's a lot of other work that does need to be done, especially around the diligence and really the certainty of information that is being produced and shared with the buyer, so that they can offer something, stick to that, and then, you know, get their advisors, get the banks on board, and have the deal funded and truly closed.
Yeah, and in many of those situations, I think you've seen this. You know, the buyers reaching out, they have a specific game plan, and oftentimes the seller will get very excited at the opportunity, and they'll overinvest their time and energy before vetting, and it can be a complete time waste it can be, detrimental in that now you've shared sensitive information with someone who may not be a qualified buyer. And I think quite simply treat it like an interview where you ask for references and say, have you bought a business before? What did it look like? Is there a banker or accountant we can speak to? I think using a common sense approach could be really valuable as well in this situation.
Yeah.
So Thomas, I know we've talked a lot about fit and how crucial it is. What are the 5 criteria that you guys look at, very high level, in terms of what makes a good buyer?
Yeah, so integrity is a huge one, right? I think the fit is paramount in these transactions. So the deals that we've seen most successful are typically when the buyer just has really good core values that are shared with the seller. So integrity is a huge factor that we're looking at. The level of responsiveness too, I think, is very telling as you're navigating a process with a buyer. There's a saying that it's not a good business to chase buyers in this space, and I do believe it because in a lot of instances where a buyer's interested, they're going to be very quick to respond, and you can sense their eagerness to continue moving forward. So level of responsiveness is definitely an aspect that we look for. Deal experience and just ability and confidence in closing the transaction, of course, I think is always something that our team is also focusing in on. Just knowing really what their process looks like, what's their due diligence that they need to do in order to fund the deal, what is their network of advisors, right? All of these things factor into really our confidence in their ability to close the transaction. Do they know what's market? Are they able to adapt and really be flexible on trying to achieve something that works for both parties versus just pushing something that is better for them, right? Especially as we deal with these transactions, like tax planning comes to mind. There are certain elements where there's concessions that need to be made on both sides to create the most beneficial structure for each party, right? So as a very specific example there, but just really what's their ability to be flexible, I think tells a lot about what their past experiences in navigating deals, knowing that it's not linear typically, right? You need to kind of make changes. Where does the actual deal fall into their overall growth strategy, right? Is it something that they're looking to do as part of a step one in a larger process, or is it really the only transaction that they're looking to acquire, right? I think understanding what their motives are and how it helps them in their growth strategy is something that we want to understand, as it again can provide us with more certainty that they're going to get to the finish line if they're doing a deal because it fits in very strategically within their portfolio versus kind of a nice to have at a later stages in that acquisition, right? And then also just what the post-acquisition alignment of the two parties looks like. I think this is where it's very interesting to get both parties in the room together and simply see how would they be able to work together once the deal is said and done to transition the business.
Right. No, and all good points. And I think, Thomas, in particular, what I find interesting is that we look at this as a partnership. And so when you're talking to a buyer, you're probably already evaluating whether or not they'd be a good fit from a partnership standpoint with the seller. There's going to be a lot of time spent through due diligence, getting to know one another. There are cases where the seller, will continue to work with the buyer, and obviously they have to get along. So yep. I really appreciate you walking us through those. Quick question though, regarding buyers who aren't as savvy. So think about an individual who has worked in an industry, has really good experience, or even a management buyout. Mm-hmm. Are those situations where you would say, hey, this could be the right buyer for this opportunity? Yeah,
absolutely. I think we've seen, again, all different shapes and sizes of buyers. And what we would do, I think, a little bit differently than some other firms is just how closely we actually try to work with the buyers despite representing the sellers in the transaction. And I think what that means for us is ensuring that we're doing a lot of the upfront work that we know the buyers are going to need to be doing in order to get the deal done. And we're also looking at the transaction from the buyer's perspective, knowing that they have different forces that they're going to be up against that they need to overcome in order to close the deal. So one of them being bank financing. Our firm really understands how the banks like to view a transaction and how to package a deal in order to get that deal passed through credit and funded. So that's something where if there's a buyer that might not have ever purchased a company before, our firm will be able to help them tremendously in really how capable they will be to get that deal across the finish line, because we know what to look for and we can help coach them as part of ensuring that our client gets what they're looking for.
So at the end of the day, Portage could essentially be working on both sides. Even though, we're hired and paid by the seller, we can still work with the buyer to make sure that they're checking all the boxes on their side. And obviously, I think another piece of the equation that's important on the buyer side is making sure they have a deal team, so we can make sure they have the right lawyer, the right accountant. We introduce them to the right bankers. But I think in the lower mid-market, it's not that uncommon that there's a little bit more hand-holding, if you will, and a lot of collaboration. I think really that's the key. So Thomas, right now I'd like to chat a little bit about the different types of buyers. And this is probably something that some folks are familiar with. They hear terms like private equity, strategic buyers, financial sponsors, individual buyers. Can you tell us a little bit about each of these different types of buyers, how they would approach an M&A deal, or what they're looking for, why they're acquiring?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'd like to simplify it because there are a number of different types of buyers that exist. I think the two biggest buckets would really be strategic buyers, like you had mentioned, and then financial sponsors. So just unpacking each of those separately, starting with strategic buyers, these are really companies that are operating and looking to grow through acquisition. So this might be someone that's either vertically or horizontally integrating. Those terms are referring to either someone that is horizontal, being a competitor that's looking to make an acquisition in your space, or vertically being someone that's either up or down the supply chain from your business that's looking to vertically integrate along the supply chain to own more of the process. So typically, the advantage of dealing with a strategic buyer is that they are already very well versed in your industry. They will understand how your business ticks a little bit quicker, likely, because of their existing involvement in that space. Unpacking the other side of the equation being financial sponsors, there's a number of different types of financial sponsors. Some of them that are pretty common would be private equity groups, family offices, and search funds, for example. Now, not to discredit any of these folks, I think a lot of these players also will have very strong industry expertise in various industries. So similar to strategics, especially in the fact that a lot of these players actually own companies or have portfolios where they'll have that industry knowledge or expertise, but they are ultimately owned by a financial sponsor. So they still do have certain characteristics that are very similar to the strategics. The big difference would likely be what the sources of capital are. In a private equity group, for example, that's typically a vehicle that is really structured to deploy capital. So the private equity group in most cases will be raising money, and they will be looking to deploy that money by purchasing privately held companies, in our case. Typically there's a horizon, like a time horizon that they're looking to achieve in regards to deploying the capital and then operating the businesses and typically selling the businesses in the future. So that would be one of the kind of subgroups within the financial sponsor bucket. Family offices would be similar to private equity groups, although typically it's a very high net worth family or potentially a group of families that is pooling their capital, own personal funds in order to deploy it for the long term, where usually it's referred to as patient capital. They aren't looking to buy and sell companies. They're usually looking to buy companies and hold them for the long term. And again, in this case, they typically would be searching for really a diverse group of businesses to have a diversified portfolio. The last group that we can touch on here would be search funds, which traditionally would be individuals, usually industry experts that are looking to take their operational expertise and go out and buy a business in that field of work, where they can really tap into their experience and where they can add value into a business. Usually this is an individual that is looking to buy a business and then run and operate that company. And in some cases they are funding and raising funds on a deal per deal basis.
So one of the last sections I'd like to touch on, Thomas, and get your take on is the market, the current market as we see it. There's a lot of interesting things that have happened post-pandemic. We've seen the rise of interest rates. We've seen reports of, the Great Resignation. We've seen, folks struggling to keep pace with finding employees and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, how does this translate to M&A? Is now a good time to sell my business? Is it hard for buyers to navigate this sort of thing? I'd love to just get your perspective on, the feedback you're getting from buyers and how they're navigating some of these more challenging times. What are you seeing?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's something that we're always watching as a team, obviously. In this case specifically with buyers, what I would say, especially with those that own companies already and they have a portfolio of businesses, one of the common themes that we've also seen in the economy is that organic growth is going to be challenging in recessionary environments. So in that instance specifically is a bit of a motivator for certain buyers to actually go out and seek for additional acquisitions in a way to achieve growth during a time where organic growth is fairly stagnant. Mm-hmm. So in some cases we've seen buyers want to acquire businesses in order to maintain the growth that they've projected or hope to achieve, right? So one example would be thinking of, a business that is experiencing issues with labor shortages, for example. That's, a very common problem that we've seen. They may go, instead of trying to hire a bunch of employees organically, they may go out to market and look to acquire a business that would fill that gap a little bit sooner than if they were to grow it organically themselves, right? So a reason where, again, doing a deal and doing an acquisition, despite what's happening in the economy, may actually help further their growth and push their mandate forward. Similarly, looking at it from the seller's perspective, I think we're always reading different headlines that are typically more focused on larger corporations, I would say. A lot of these things, just from a practical standpoint for our clients, if you're dealing with supply chain issues or increased interest rates or, again, labor shortages, that creates a bit of a headache for small business owners. And a lot of our clients aren't necessarily trying to time a sale, but what will push them to want to sell is different stresses and different forces that they're feeling. So if they're experiencing significant issues from supply chains or from labor shortages, that may actually push our potential clients to want to have a conversation about selling, because it's a chance for them to move on to the next phase in their life and not have to worry about what's going to happen in the economy. And a lot of our clients have been through how many recessions before, and just not being interested in moving on. So you kind of have a personal decision that could be pushing a business owner to wanting to sell. And then also on the buyer side, different growth initiatives that may complement nicely in that they would want to make an acquisition to alleviate the same issues that our clients may be feeling.
Yeah, and on that point, I mean, you probably read this, the BDC study that says nearly 10% of small, mid-sized businesses in Canada are going to be selling to a third-party buyer in the next 5 years. It's about 116,000 companies. That's a lot of companies, a lot of people going to market. Do you think that there's an even number of buyers out there, or do you think that buyers are going to have the upper hand? What's your take on this?
I think there are a number of buyers that exist and are going to continue to exist in the marketplace. Based on the activity levels that we see both locally and abroad, there are certainly more buyers that continue to come into the marketplace and again chase the returns that the private equity space or private businesses in general have been able to produce, right? So again, tying it back to the overall economy, so long as these returns continue to outperform other asset classes, we feel like this is going to be a strong investment opportunity that buyers are going to continue to want to invest in.
And I think from my perspective too, so long as buyers have funding, they'll continue to acquire. As long as it makes sense on an ROI perspective,
Yep.
there'll be deals, had during this time. With respect to interest rates, I mean, that's a topic that is commonly discussed. How have the banks dealt with this? Because I feel like banks are much more in tune of what's going on than we give them credit for. And a lot of these things are being solved kind of behind closed doors without people being aware of it. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I think what we've seen within that space is that there's obviously changes in the market, but overall, banks are still eager to lend money and to be involved in these transactions. They don't want to lose out on market share. So while there might be certain preferences or certain industries that banks are more comfortable with than others, we still overall see in Canada, for the time being, a lot of interest in lower middle market transactions and supporting buyers, and again, supporting the local economies, right? I think that's the bigger picture that Canada does try to focus on to a certain extent, is ensuring that through these succession plans, the employees, the stakeholders, and kind of the communities that the businesses operate in can continue through that succession plan and not have to close their doors because there's no bank financing, and as a result, buyers aren't able to do deals.
That brings us to the end of the episode, Thomas. Is there anything you'd like to add or share?
Ultimately, buyers aren't all created equal. I think there's good and bad in each type of buyer category that we spoke about. But the one thing that we would advise our clients is ensure that you do have someone that's helping you with the sale, to ensure that you're not getting outgunned by a party that has done a lot of deals, and ensure that you're getting the best outcome possible.
Awesome. Really appreciate your time, Thomas, and your insight, and really appreciate you joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to the Selling Successfully podcast, and thank you to my guest, Thomas, for joining us today. If you'd like to get in touch with Thomas, you can find him on our website or contact him via email at thomas.bevilacqua at portagemadvisory.com. That's Thomas, Thomas, .bevilacqua, BEVILACQUA at portagemadvisory.com. For those of you interested, we've created key takeaways that you can download and access via our podcast page. Please remember to like or subscribe to keep this podcast handy, and we'll see you next time.